So this has been really the only bright spot in the Chinese economy. Their export trade, their industrial production have been very strong over this recent period. And, a lot of this has to do with, the CCP control continuing to flex its muscle in terms of a state economy competing with a market economy. I wrote about this 20 years ago in America's Financial Apocalypse, the cheating by China, and I continue to write about it and talk about it over the years, the increased government subsidization. And so, this is what they're doing. China is preparing for war, and they are cheating in trade, arguably more so than they have in previous years, even. You don't hear about it, but they are subsidizing all of their industries and flooding the market. And let me just mention one thing. I should actually do a video on it because no one's talking about this in the world. And it takes quite a bit of understanding to come up with it, but it doesn't take much understanding when you hear it. And that is Trump supposedly waging all these tariffs to protect U.S. industry, to level the playing field from China's cheating. And he talked about bringing the jobs back, yet he hasn't brought the jobs back, right? Not from China. That's the big issue. If you can imagine, we don't have any type of potential military or geopolitical skirmish coming up with India or any of the other countries out there that we deal with for the most part. China is one that we do. And so my point is that from a military strategy, geopolitical strategy standpoint, we don't really need to bring the jobs back from India or other countries. Economically, it's a different issue. You understand that there should be a focus in Washington on geopolitics and military strategy, a very intense one. There needs to be. And I've said before, I think that Washington is screwing everything up. They're taking everything lightly. So my point is that strategically, from a geopolitical and military standpoint, it should be a focus to bring the jobs back from China. Not to mention the economic benefits. Why do I say that? Well, think about it for a second. Trump is complaining about the U.S. trade deficit, and he's pointing to China. Well, what do? Well, he's raising tariffs. That's the purpose of the tariffs, to balance the trade. Well, think about it for a second. Why doesn't he just bring the jobs back? That's the best way to strengthen the U.S. economy and to reduce the trade deficit. In addition to securing U.S. assets and strengthening the military strategy through removing access that China has to U.S. IP, intellectual property. Look at the trade between the U.S. and China. And I'm going to simplify this. Okay, I'm going to make some broad generalizations. I've talked about this before. No one wants to talk about it. I guess people are just this stupid. I don't understand why. It's pretty basic to me. Think about the trade between the U.S. and China. Generally, broadly speaking, you're talking about the U.S. exporting to China agricultural products, food and beverage, you know, some Boeing planes, some things, some raw materials, but for the most part, we're not benefiting from that. We can sell our agriculture anywhere. The U.S. government can subsidize the farmers. They can take care of that. The trade relationship is one-sided. China's reaping virtually all the benefit. Ask yourself, well, what are you talking about, Mike? It's supporting agricultural jobs. Well, a large part of the trade is agricultural. And this is what Trump is constantly fighting for. More, China to import more ag products from America. Ask yourself how that helps the U.S. economy. How does that help U.S. jobs? Do you know who works in the ag industry on those farms? We're talking the corporate farms. They employ low-wage, largely undocumented workers that don't have benefits. Boeing, okay, those are good jobs. But we don't need China's business to keep Boeing rolling around. You've got a duopoly in the commercial aircraft industry, Airbus and Boeing. So that doesn't really matter. And China's benefiting greatly from getting our Boeing jets because they can't make their own. But guess what? They've been reverse engineering those jets for years, and eventually they're going to be able to make their own. Once again, another transfer of intellectual property. It's a huge issue. Boeing's not just a commercial aircraft, they're a defense company. Now let's take a look at a large source of this trade deficit. Now it's the West, but several years ago it was primarily America, corporate America. You can imagine, let's just look at America's case. All the jobs that have been sent to China. If you take a look at corporate America, Apple, how many millions of jobs are in China as a result of corporate America? The Apple factories, the Tesla factories, the Microsoft facilities, the list goes on and on and on. How many millions of jobs have been created in China as a result of corporate America outsourcing? Those are jobs that could be in America to boost the US economy, to boost incomes. Not only that, of course, but China is stealing intellectual property and has been for a long time as a result of those companies being there. That's why China has these vast manufacturing plants. You think they created that stuff on their own? Of course not. They copied all that shit from our factories. Know-how is a segment of intellectual property. The know-how, manufacturing know-how. So think about it for a second. Apple produces all these phones in China. That is contributing to the US trade deficit. So if you moved all those jobs back, there would be a much lower trade deficit. There would be a much lower ability of the CCP to steal intellectual property. No one's talking about this. And you know why? Because it all centers around corporate America. You see, because corporate America is benefiting from all this. So this trend that I originally highlighted and discussed in detail 20 years ago in my 2006 book, it remains today. There's been no change. Not just this trend of outsourcing to China and unfair trade. Trump is full of shit. Okay, he's full of shit. He says one thing and does another thing. He does things and pretends, makes up reasons why he's doing things, just like the tariffs. Another trend that I clearly and comprehensively discussed in detail was America's healthcare crisis. It's the same thing going on today. And you might want to take a look. I don't know if they've been published yet, but we did some chat GPT audits and analysis of my healthcare research, even just focusing on chapter 7 of America's Financial Apocalypse, the healthcare chapter. And it compared that analysis with all the architects of Obamacare, ACA. And it concluded that I was on the right path. I predicted everything. They should have listened to me. ACA wasn't even close to approaching the issue. I wrote about that in my healthcare book. And I'm bringing up healthcare because it's obviously that's a domestic issue, has nothing really to do with China for the most part. I'm bringing that up when we talk about later on the jobs report. Over the past several months, not every month, but most of the months, the job growth been led by healthcare. And I mentioned that I think last time. And the reason why is one of the problems in the US healthcare industry. So anyway, you can just read the rest of this. You probably already have. Youth unemployment rates are at 17%. Structural issues in China remain. Deflation looks to be improving on paper just because of the oil prices, but it's the deflation in China is structural. I'm going to go on a limb. I haven't thought about this, but I'm going to go on a limb, and I'm not an economist, but I'm going to go ahead and say deflation is a structural issue. Anytime you see declining prices, that's not necessarily deflation. That's in the short term, it's deleveraging of asset prices, unwinding of asset debt. But a deflationary problem is structural, and you can see that in China. And that's why deflation, typically, you're talking about long periods. We've been talking about this for a long time now. The problems in the real estate market in China, of course, the weak consumer spending. uncertainty over export trade via tariffs, and of course the demographic